I never thought I'd be the kind of guy telling a story like this. My life wasn't a soap opera. I wasn't the tragic lead in some messed up drama. I was just a guy, 32 years old, working a stable job, living in a house that wasn't fancy but was mine. I had routines, I had peace, and I had Grace. My wife. My best friend. My everything. She was the kind of woman who made everything feel brighter just by walking into a room. Her laughter was the kind you heard once and wanted to hear again. We had been married for 5 years, and even on the bad days, we had each other. We had this life, this small but beautiful world we built together. And then my brother, Daniel, decided to burn it to the ground. He was always the golden boy, 35, worked in finance, drove an imported car that he never shut up about. He had dad's approval, mom's attention, and the kind of arrogance that came from never having to face real consequences. He made money, he made connections, and somewhere along the way, he decided he could make my wife his. I didn't see it at first. Maybe I didn't want to. The small things, the way Daniel always managed to be around when I wasn't, the way Grace would laugh a little too hard at his jokes, the way he always made comments about how I could do better in life. None of it clicked. Because who thinks that their own brother would betray them like that? But the truth has a way of catching up. It was a Friday night. Grace and I had a tradition. Every first Friday of the month, we'd go to this little Mexican place down the street, the one where the owner knew our usual order and brought us extra chips without asking. It was supposed to be one of those nights. Instead, I found myself walking into a bar after work, my stomach sinking as I caught sight of them. Daniel and Grace, sitting too close, whispering, smiling in that way, like they had a secret. And for the first time in my life, I saw it. Really saw it. I walked straight up to them, the anger boiling in my chest, my hands clenched so hard I could feel my nails digging into my palms. Grace looked up, and I'll never forget what I saw in her face. Not guilt, not fear, just relief, like she was glad I finally figured it out. Daniel smirked. Hey, little brother. Took you long enough. I didn't punch him. Maybe I should have. Maybe I would have felt better if I had. But at that moment, all I could do was stand there, letting the realization crash over me like a wave. Everything I had built, everything I had trusted, it was gone. I turned around and walked out. But that was just the beginning. Because what they didn't know was that they weren't the only ones keeping secrets. And before this was over, they were going to learn exactly what it felt like to lose everything. The silence in my house was suffocating. I sat on the edge of the couch, staring at the framed wedding photo on the wall, the one where Grace was laughing, her head tilted back, her hand gripping mine like we were holding on to forever. It felt like a lifetime ago. Now, all I could see was the way she looked at Daniel, the way her body leaned into his like he was gravity itself. I should have confronted her. I should have screamed, thrown things, demanded answers. But what was the point? I already knew. And yet, that night, she came home like nothing happened. She walked through the door, kicked off her shoes, and stretched like she had just come back from a long shift instead of from a night of betrayal. She saw me sitting there, motionless, and paused. You okay? She asked, casual, like I was just lost in thought and not drowning in the wreckage of my marriage. I exhaled slowly, pressing my fingers against my temples. I saw you. Her expression didn't change. No shock, no guilt, just a slight tilt of her head, a flicker of something in her eyes. Annoyance. Like I was the one ruining her night. Okay, she said, dropping her bag on the table. So, what do you want to do about it? I let out a hollow laugh. That's all you have to say? What do you want me to say, Nate? She sighed, rubbing her temples. That I didn't mean for it to happen? That I still love you. She shook her head. We both know that would be a lie. I clenched my jaw, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. How long? She crossed her arms, shifting her weight to one side. Does it matter? Yeah, it does. A pause. Then, finally, she shrugged. A year. Maybe longer. A year. A whole damn year. I let out a shaky breath, staring at the floor, my hands gripping my knees so tightly my knuckles turned white. The weight of it pressed down on me, crushing, suffocating. And then she said the one thing that made it all so much worse. You had to see this coming, Nate. My head snapped up. What? She rolled her eyes, like I was some child who didn't understand basic math. Come on. You were always comfortable. Happy with your little routines, your safe little life. But I needed more. And Daniel, he has ambition. He makes me feel alive. The words cut through me like a blade. I could have fought. I could have begged. But in that moment, I realized something. I didn't want her anymore. Not the woman standing in front of me, not the version of Grace that saw me as something she had outgrown. I stood up, grabbed my keys, and walked past her. You can pack your things in the morning. I heard her scoff as I stepped outside. That's it. You're not even going to fight for me. I turned back, met her gaze one last time, and said the only thing that mattered. You're not worth fighting for. Then I left. I drove for hours, winding through streets that blurred together in the glow of streetlights. I didn't know where I was going until I ended up at my father's house. He was in his workshop when I arrived, the scent of sawdust and varnish thick in the air. He glanced up when I walked in, taking one look at my face before setting down his tools. What happened? I sank onto a stool, rubbing a hand over my face. Daniel. My voice cracked. He took Grace. For a long moment, my father said nothing. Then, slowly, he walked over and sat across from me, his fingers lacing together on the table. I know, he said. I frowned, my stomach twisting. What do you mean, you know? He sighed, shaking his head. I've known for a while. My chest tightened. And you didn't tell me? I wanted to. But I also wanted to see if you'd see it yourself. He leaned back, crossing his arms. I figured you deserved the truth from them, not from me. Anger bubbled in my gut. But before I could respond, he leaned forward, his voice lower, heavier. But there's something else you don't know. I blinked. What? Dad reached into a drawer and pulled out a thick folder, sliding it across the table. Daniel didn't just take your wife, son. He took more than that. I hesitated before opening it. Inside were documents, financial records, emails, contracts. I skimmed through them, my heart pounding as the pieces fell into place. Daniel had been stealing. Not just from me. From my father. From our family's business. Hundreds of thousands of dollars. Funneled through shell accounts. Wiped from company ledgers. Hidden behind fake transactions. I swallowed hard, my fingers trembling. He's been robbing you? Dad exhaled through his nose, his expression unreadable. And now, I think it's time he gets what's coming to him. I looked up, meeting his gaze. And for the first time since my world fell apart, I felt something other than heartbreak. I felt fury. I closed the folder, my jaw tightening. What do we do? Dad smiled grimly. We hit him where it hurts. And just like that, the game changed. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my father's kitchen table, the folder spread open in front of me, every page another reminder of how deep my brother's betrayal ran. The numbers blurred together, a mess of bank transfers, hidden expenses, and fabricated invoices. Daniel wasn't just a liar. He was a thief. And now, it was time to take everything back. Dad sat across from me, sipping his coffee like this was just another business meeting. I've been gathering this for months, he said. Didn't want to act too soon. Had to be sure. I shook my head, flipping through the pages. How did I not see it? How did nobody else? He's smart, Dad admitted. I'll give him that. But greed makes people sloppy. He got comfortable. Thought he was untouchable. He set his mug down with a soft thud. What do you want to do, son? I looked at him. What do you mean? This is your fight as much as mine. More, even. He stole from you too, in more ways than one. His eyes hardened. So I'll ask again. What do you want to do? I knew the answer before he even finished asking. I wanted to ruin him. I wanted to take back what was mine, piece by piece, until he was left with nothing but the consequences of his own actions. I exhaled slowly. We expose him. Everything. The fraud, the money laundering, whatever it takes. Dad nodded, as if he expected nothing less. Then we start with the board. That morning, I walked into my father's company for the first time in years. I had worked there once, back before I moved into my own career. But I had never belonged in the same way Daniel did. Or at least, that's what everyone thought. The receptionist's eyes widened when she saw me. Nathan? I gave a tight smile. Morning, Lisa. My father in his office. She nodded quickly. He's waiting for you. I took the elevator up to the top floor, my pulse steady despite the storm brewing in my chest. When I stepped into the boardroom, Daniel was already there. And so was Grace. She sat beside him, legs crossed, wearing a dress I had bought for her years ago. The irony burned. Daniel leaned back in his chair, flashing that same smirk that had haunted me for days. Well, he mused. If it isn't the prodigal son. I ignored him, taking my seat beside Dad. The other board members looked tense, like they knew something was coming but weren't sure what. Dad cleared his throat. Gentlemen, we have some business to discuss. Daniel laughed, drumming his fingers on the table. Let me guess. This is about whatever nonsense Nathan's been feeding you? He rolled his eyes. Come on, Dad. We both know he doesn't have the stomach for it. I slid the folder across the table. Shut up and read. His smirk faltered. Slowly, he reached for the folder, flipping it open. His eyes scanned the pages, and for the first time in his life, I saw real fear flicker in his expression. Grace leaned in, peering over his shoulder. What is this? Dad folded his hands on the table. It's proof that your fiancé has been stealing from this company for the past 3 years. Daniel scoffed. This is ridiculous. Do you have any idea what you're accusing me of? Of course, Dad said smoothly. That's why I made sure the IRS and the feds got copies too. The room fell silent. Daniel's face went pale. You wouldn't. Dad shrugged. Already did. One of the board members, a graying man named Howard, cleared his throat. Daniel, is this true? Daniel slammed the folder shut. I don't have to sit here and listen to this. You think you can just walk in here and out? That's exactly what we think. I cut in. He turned to me, his jaw clenched. You had nothing before me, Nate. Nothing. I made something of myself while you sat around playing house. I leaned forward, lowering my voice. And yet, I'm still here. And you? You're done. Grace's eyes darted between us. Daniel, tell me this isn't real. He ignored her. Dad, he pleaded, his voice cracking. You can't do this. You can't just throw me away. Dad exhaled. You threw yourself away, son. Security arrived a few minutes later. Daniel fought it, of course. He yelled, threatened lawsuits, but none of it mattered. By the time he was escorted out, the board had already voted. His termination was unanimous. Grace stayed behind, sitting in shock as the room emptied. I stood to leave, but she grabbed my arm. Nate, she whispered. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. I looked down at her hand, then back at her face. I don't care. Then I walked away, leaving her to sit in the wreckage she helped create. But this wasn't over yet. Because Daniel had spent years tearing me down, taking everything from me. Now, it was my turn. Daniel was out. Out of the company, out of the family. And if things went the way I wanted, soon to be out of options. But people like Daniel don't go down quietly. 2 days after the board meeting, I got a text from an unknown number. Daniel, you think this is over? You have no idea what you've started. I stared at the message for a moment before chuckling to myself. Of course he couldn't just take the loss. That wasn't in his nature. Daniel had spent his entire life believing he was untouchable. He wasn't about to change now. I didn't bother responding. Instead, I focused on the next step. Because while I had taken Daniel down professionally, that wasn't enough. I needed to make sure he couldn't weasel his way into another job, another scheme, another life where he could manipulate and steal from people who trusted him. And for that, I had to go deeper. Dad had already handed the evidence over to the authorities, but I wasn't content with waiting for the slow grind of legal justice. I wanted him to feel the loss the way I had, to know what it was like to have the foundation beneath him crumble. So I started digging. With the help of a few contacts in finance, I got my hands on more than just the company records. Turns out, Daniel had been bleeding money in places even Dad hadn't noticed. Offshore accounts, unpaid debts, a string of bad investments disguised as business ventures. He was hemorrhaging cash to keep up the illusion of success. The house he and Grace had moved into after she left me? He didn't own it. It was leased under a corporate name, one of the shell companies he used to funnel stolen money. With him out of the company, the lease was about to be revoked. The car? Not paid off. The lavish vacations, the designer clothes, the expensive dinners? All of it was financed by borrowed time and stolen money. Daniel had built his kingdom out of sand. And the tide was coming in. The first real crack appeared when Grace showed up at my door. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. When I opened the door, she looked different. Not the confident, smug woman who had sat beside Daniel in the boardroom, basking in his success. No, this Grace was disheveled, her makeup smudged, her expression tight with desperation. Nate, she breathed. Can we talk? I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms. Talk? Now you want to talk? She swallowed hard. I didn't know about the money. I swear, I didn't. I thought, she trailed off, biting her lip. I thought I was choosing a better life. I laughed, shaking my head. You thought you were upgrading. Her eyes flashed, but she didn't deny it. Daniel's losing everything, she said after a long pause. The house, the car, he's not who I thought he was. I raised a brow. And what? You think I am? She reached for my arm. Nate, I made a mistake. I let out a slow breath, then leaned in, just close enough that she thought, maybe, just maybe, I was considering it. And then I said exactly what she had said to me the night I confronted her. You had to see this coming. She flinched. For the first time, she looked small, defeated, alone. I stepped back and shut the door in her face. A week later, Daniel's world officially collapsed. The bank seized the house. The luxury car was repossessed. Creditors started circling, and with every bridge he burned, fewer people were willing to help. Then came the real blow, the arrest. The Financial Crimes Division had been building their case for weeks, and when the evidence came together, it was airtight. I wasn't there when the police showed up at his apartment, but I heard about it. Heard about how he tried to argue, to deny, to negotiate. Heard about how Grace, his once devoted fiancée, didn't lift a finger to help him. Funny how love disappears when the money runs out. Daniel was charged with fraud, embezzlement, and half a dozen other white-collar crimes. The brother who once mocked me for my boring little life was now facing years in prison. And I had everything I needed, except for one last thing. Because before this was over, I needed to see him one last time. And when I did, I would make sure he knew the truth. I won. I didn't visit Daniel in jail right away. Not because I didn't want to, but because I wanted him to sit there for a while, stewing in the reality of what his life had become. No more luxury, no more power, no more people whispering about how brilliant he was. Just cold walls, metal bars, and the undeniable truth that he had lost everything. By the time I finally made my way to the detention center, he looked nothing like the brother I once knew. His hair was a mess, his face unshaven, his once expensive clothes replaced with a standard orange jumpsuit. When he saw me through the glass, he let out a bitter laugh. Well, look who finally showed up. I picked up the phone receiver, keeping my expression neutral. You look like hell. Daniel scoffed. Yeah, well, that happens when your little brother turns your life into a dumpster fire. I tilted my head. I didn't turn your life into anything, Daniel. You did that all on your own. He leaned forward, his eyes burning with resentment. You think you're better than me, don't you? I shrugged. Not better. Just smarter. His jaw clenched. You really think this is over? That I'll stay in here forever? I leaned closer, lowering my voice. You stole from Dad. From the company. From Mom's medical fund. His face twitched at the last part, but I kept going. You're not getting out of this, Daniel. The feds don't let people like you walk away. His smirk faltered, but he recovered quickly. I'll find a way. I always do. I chuckled, shaking my head. Not this time. We sat in silence for a moment, the hum of the prison around us. Then I said it. You know what the best part is? He didn't answer, but I saw the muscle in his jaw tighten. The company you always bragged about running? It's mine now. Daniel blinked, his mouth parting slightly. Dad made me head of finance. I'm learning everything you thought only you were capable of. And guess what? The business is doing better without you. I smiled. Turns out, success isn't about stealing. It's about working for it. Daniel exhaled sharply, his hands clenching into fists. You think you've won? I nodded. I don't think. I know. His breathing grew uneven, like he was fighting every urge to snap. I could see it, how badly he wanted to throw something, to lash out, to find some way to regain control. But he couldn't. Not anymore. I stood, still holding the receiver to my ear. Enjoy your stay, big brother. Then I hung up and walked out, leaving Daniel exactly where he belonged, behind bars. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. Because a week later, I got a call that changed everything. I was at the office, sitting through yet another meeting, when my phone buzzed. The number was unfamiliar, but something told me to step out and take it. Nate. The voice on the other end was hesitant. Female. I frowned. Who's this? A long pause. Then, it's Grace. I nearly hung up right then. But something in her tone stopped me. She didn't sound smug or entitled. She sounded afraid. What do you want? I asked, my voice clipped. Another pause. Then she whispered, I need your help. I let out a bitter laugh. You must be joking. I'm serious. Her voice was tight, urgent. It's Daniel. He's in trouble. I rolled my eyes. Yeah, Grace, I know. He's in jail. No, you don't get it, she said, her voice shaking now. He's not safe in there. My stomach twisted, but I kept my tone flat. And why should I care? She let out a shaky breath. Because they're going to kill him. I didn't want to believe her. After everything Daniel had done, after all the damage he caused, I shouldn't have cared what happened to him. But something about the desperation in Grace's voice lingered in my head. That night, I found myself sitting in my living room, staring at the ceiling while my cat, Luna, curled up beside me. I hated that I was even considering it. Daniel deserved this. He deserved to suffer. But did he deserve to die? The next day, I made a call to an old friend who had connections in law enforcement. He didn't give me much, but he gave me enough. Daniel had pissed off the wrong people. Turns out, when you commit financial crimes, you don't just steal from corporations. Sometimes, you steal from dangerous people. People who don't call lawyers. People who don't file lawsuits. People who make problems disappear. And now, in prison, those people had found him. I sat with that information for hours. I didn't know Daniel anything. Not after what he did to me. But I had a choice. Let him rot. Let him pay for what he did. Or step in, one last time. And for reasons I couldn't even explain to myself, I picked up the phone. "Dad," I said, my voice steady. "We need to talk. Because as much as I hated him, as much as he deserved every bit of this, I wasn't ready to let my brother die. I told myself I was making the call for my father's sake. He had already lost one son in every way that mattered. Losing Daniel completely, even after everything, would break him. I told myself that was the reason. But deep down, I knew the truth. Daniel had ruined my life. Stolen my wife. Humiliated me. Took everything he could get his hands on. But in the end, I wasn't like him. I wasn't someone who stood by and let things happen, even if he deserved it. Dad met me at his office an hour later. He didn't look surprised when I told him what I had learned. Just tired. "I figured something like this would happen," he admitted, rubbing a hand over his face. I frowned. "You knew." "I knew he made enemies." Dad sighed. "I just didn't think they'd reach him in prison this fast." A heavy silence stretched between us. Finally, he asked, "What do you want to do?" I hesitated. Because the truth was, I didn't know. I had spent so much time tearing Daniel down, making sure he lost everything the way I had. And now, here I was, considering saving him. I shook my head. "I don't know, Dad." Dad exhaled slowly, staring at the papers spread across his desk. "I can pull some strings. See if I can get him moved." "To where?" "To a lower security facility," Dad said. "It's risky, but it's better than leaving him where he is." I nodded, running a hand through my hair. "Do it." Dad didn't argue. He just picked up the phone and started making calls. 3 days later, Daniel was moved. I didn't visit him. Not immediately. I told myself it didn't matter if he knew I was involved or not. That it didn't change what he did, what he took from me. But when I finally walked into the visitation room a week later, I saw something I had never seen before in my brother's eyes. Gratitude. He picked up the receiver slowly, staring at me like he wasn't sure I was real. "You did this." I nodded once. "Yeah." He swallowed hard, his throat working. "Why?" I exhaled, gripping the receiver tighter. "Because I'm not you." A muscle in his jaw twitched. He leaned back, rubbing a hand over his face. When he looked at me again, the cockiness, the smugness, all of it was gone. "I deserved everything," he admitted. His voice was rough, tired. "But not this." I didn't say anything. We sat there in silence for a long time. Then, finally, I said, "I'm not doing this for you, Daniel. I'm doing it for Dad." He nodded slowly. "I know." And maybe, in some twisted way, that was enough. The fallout of everything left its scars. Daniel was sentenced to 8 years in prison. A reduced sentence, thanks to Dad's intervention. But still, 8 years locked away, with nothing but time to think about what he had done. Grace disappeared after everything collapsed. She tried reaching out a few more times, but I never responded. The last I heard, she had moved to another city, trying to start over. I wished her the best, but from a distance. Dad retired 6 months later, handing full control of the company to me. I wasn't sure I wanted it at first, but once I settled into the role, I realized something. This was what I was meant to do. Not in Daniel's way, not through greed or manipulation, but by actually building something. Something real, something lasting. One evening, as I sat on my back porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, my cat curled up beside me, I thought about everything that had happened. The betrayals, the losses, the fights, and then the victories. Because in the end, Daniel lost everything. And me? I was finally free.